Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about twin turbos. Now, in the early to late 1990s, it was fairly common for some halo cars to run a twin turbocharger system. So Nissan had it on the GTRs from the R32 to the R34 and the 300ZX as well. Mazda had it on the RX-7 FD and Toyota had it on the JZA80 Supra. And Toyota also had it on the some of the 1JZ twin turbo engines like on the Soras and that sort of thing. Now, in this article, we're only going to discuss the Mazda RX-7 FD sequential twin turbocharger system. Broadly speaking, there are two types of twin turbo systems. In the first one, the two turbochargers run all the time, and this is called a parallel twin turbo system. In a sequential twin turbo system, at low RPM, only one of the turbos is running, and this allows it to spool up very quickly because you have a lot of exhaust gas going through a little turbo. But then at higher RPM, so that the turbo doesn't choke, a second turbo is brought in. The exhaust gas is shared between the two turbochargers, and they both help to make the boost. The hard part, as you might expect, is the transition between the two. Now, in the RX-7 FD, the two turbochargers are the same size. So at low RPM, all the exhaust gas goes from both rotors into the single turbocharger, so the primary turbo. So this means that the flap that allows exhaust gas to go into the second turbocharger turbine is shut, and the exhaust either has to go through the primary turbo or through the wastegate. The compressed air from the primary turbo is fed into the or through the intercooler and into the throttle body, so that that doesn't bleed backwards through the primary turbo compressor. There's a separate flap in the intake called the charge control valve, which shuts this off. So in this condition, the charge control valve in the intake is closed, and also the turbo control valve, it's called in the Mazda manual, is closed as well, which prevents the exhaust getting into the second turbo. At high RPM, both of these are open, so that allows the exhaust to go through the second turbo, and it allows the compressed air to come out from the second turbo and into the intake system. Now in the RX-7 there are two chambers with check valves on them. One of them is charged up with boost, and the other one is a vacuum tank and a boost tank. Most of the solenoid valves that control these flaps are 3-port valves, so they either connect boost to one side of the diaphragm or vacuum. So on most of them there are actually 2 ports going to servo diaphragm, or an actuator if you like, and so to drive it in one way you connect boost to one side and vacuum to the other, and to drive it the other way you connect boost to the second side and vacuum to the first side. Now these two solenoid valves are driven off the same output from the ECU, so it's only one output as far as the ECU is concerned, but it drives 2 physical solenoids. And obviously the check valves have to work. You've got to have boost in the boost tank and vacuum in the vacuum tank, because you're not going to have any vacuum on boost, and you're not going to have any boost when you're on vacuum, and also the hoses all need to go to the right place. Now the tricky part comes with the transition. You can imagine that if we've been boosting hard on the first turbo and it's actually starting to choke, run out of airflow as the RPM increases, and we want to bring the second turbo in, then if you just suddenly open both flaps at once, then you have turbo lag because the second turbo hasn't been spinning. So what the engineers at Mazda did was they brought out a second flap in the exhaust called the pre-control valve, and when this flap is open it allows a small amount of exhaust gas to go through the secondary turbine to spool it up. Now the theory is that once that's spooled up to the correct operating speed, you can then open the main turbo control valve and also the charge control valve, and then you've got both turbos running together and everything's wonderful. Now to allow the second turbo to spin, what Mazda have is they have a charge relief valve which is on the exit of the second compressor, but before the charge control valve. So what happens is, as the second turbo is spooled up, it's allowed to vent to atmosphere, or in the factory system it goes back into the airbox, which allows it to spool up quickly. Now, because the turbo is not actually making boost in this condition, it's just pushing air, it needs a lot less exhaust gas to spin the rotor up than if it was making boost at the same time. Now, having said that, you still do get a bit of a dip in the boost when you open this pre-control valve, because first of all you're losing some exhaust pressure to the second turbo, so there's less exhaust pressure available for the first turbo, which means it's going to slow down a little bit and you're going to lose a little bit of boost. Now the harder you're boosting on the first turbo, the worse this is going to be, for 2 reasons. The first reason is, if you're boosting hard on the first turbo, that means you're going to have a lot more exhaust pressure. So that means that when the pre-control valve is opened, you actually have more pressure to lose, so it's actually going to drop the boost faster than if you're a lower boost pressure. The second thing is that to avoid a major dip in the transition, you have to spin the second turbo up to the point where it's producing the same boost that the first turbo is producing. And if the first turbo is producing a lot of boost, then you also need to spin up the second turbo to a high speed so that it can make the same boost so you don't get the dip. So when driving a lot of boost on the first turbo, it can actually be quite difficult to get that transition nice. So what we actually do now is we actually start turning on the pre-control valve earlier, but we pulse width modulate it so it's not as big an exhaust pressure drop on the primary turbo at once, and that seems to smooth out the transition a bit better. Now in terms of the settings required to make this all work, the ECU needs a minimum map and TPS, which it will activate the secondary turbo. So below either of those, the secondary turbo won't activate. The ECU also has a twin turbo RPM, which is the RPM above which the second turbo will be enabled. Now to enable the pre-control, the ECU needs to be able to know when to start opening the pre-control valve to spin the second turbo up to the right speed. Now I've seen on some other ECUs they have an RPM window, but really the turbo is going to spin up in a certain period of time depending on the inertia of the turbo and that sort of thing. So if you were to give it an RPM window, then that RPM window will need to be different in different gears because they'll correspond to a different time. So what we do instead is we have a fixed time that you enter into the ECU, and the ECU looks at the current rate of RPM increase and the current RPM and works out, based on if we continue to accelerate at the same rate, what point do we need to open the pre-control valve. So then there's only one setting to worry about and you don't need to worry about it after that. And the values that we've settled on are 4400 RPM and 1200 milliseconds, so 1.2 seconds. Now it's not actually open for 1.2 seconds, it's actually open for a much smaller part of that because it is pulse width modulated, so it's coming in very gently. Now this feature is a little bit redundant now since turbocharger technology has come a long way in the last 25 years, and single turbos these days can boost very hard. If you look at the offerings from EFR, for example, or the EFR offerings from Borg Warner, they spool up very quickly even on rotaries. But there are still a lot of Series 8s out there which still have the factory twins on them, so that's why we offer that control. Now on the plug and play ECUs, that's all you need to set up, and that's all done in the base map anyway, so that's all you need to do. If you're wiring in an ECU though, there's a couple of things that need to be observed. So the first one is the charge control output and the twin turbo control outputs. Each of them drives two solenoid valves like I mentioned before, but they're actually in opposite polarity. So when the engine's at idle, the twin turbo control output needs to be off. The charge control output needs to be on to close the flap in the inlet manifold. Otherwise, if you don't have that on, the first turbo's boost will all be fed back through the second turbo, and it just won't make boost at low RPM at all. And the second one is that the pre-control output needs to be inverted. That's just, again, the way that the solenoids are wired and plumbed from factory. So you need to set the output that drives the pre-control valve to be inverted. And if you PWM it at 25 Hz, that's what we've found works pretty well to smooth out the transition. And secondly, the charge relief valve should be connected in parallel with the twin turbo control valve, because what that does is that allows the second turbo outlet to vent while we're still on the first turbo, which includes the time when we're doing the pre-control function. And that allows it to spool up without surging so badly. Thank you very much.